Political and high-level buy-in is critical for any reform to start off or be sustained. Once this has been received, the baton is passed on to the technocrats. And this, my dear friends, is where reforms go to gain momentum or to quietly die off. In this episode, we will be reflecting on what happened with the debt swaps after the political approvals were received. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Centers and Margins. This is a podcast where I reflect on global health, systems change, and what it means to lead and to learn from those areas where people, power, politics, and reforms collide. My name is Nkechi Olalere, a health financing and systems advisor, and I'm your host. In episode 1 of this series of this podcast that is dedicated to debt swaps, we looked at the origin story for debt swaps. We reflected on my conversation with the Minister of Health in Sierra Leone, where he shared his great ambitions for the health sector, and how, of course, conversations inevitably landed on the fiscal space for health available to carry out all of these reforms. This led to a long process of research, literature review to see what was available to help the country, and then how I landed on the debt swaps. It also talked about doing also the research to understand how countries that had used the debt swap actually did that. What were the good things that happened? What were the benefits? What were the demerits? How could this potentially then be something that would be useful for Sierra Leone? It's important to flag that, of course, even while looking at these debt swaps as one of the ways of increasing the fiscal space, it was important that we also capture that within the larger health system and speak to other things that were also happening in the space, including increasing efficiency and making sure that we were prioritizing appropriately. And so the debt swaps were only really coming in as another tool in the larger toolbox for health financing for the country. Episode 2 picks up from how all the lessons from this research and literature review were then taken into conversations with the Global Fund, back with the Minister of Health, with the high-level cabinet member, and of course with the Ministry of Finance. Episode 2 ends with the Minister of Finance mandating the Financial Secretary to move forward with the implementation of the debt swap. And so, episode 3 kicks off from this point. The debt swap had found a home. The Ministry of Finance, it had found an implementing ministry, had found a face. The very first thing that the Financial Secretary did was to instruct the Director for Public Debt to update the debt stock, to be very clear about all the key creditors for the country and to update the amounts that were being owed to these countries. Once that was done, the Financial Secretary asked for a meeting with the Global Fund, and this was scheduled. The meeting was well attended by both the Ministry of Finance and also the leadership of the Ministry of Health, led by the Permanent Secretary and the Chief Medical Officer, and then of course we had Global Fund. And at the meeting, the questions were very insightful. The answers were very insightful. The country, Sierra Leone, wanted to know, tell us about how this debt swap works. What are the concerns that other countries that have done this had? Is this something that potentially could be used in Sierra Leone? And then when they heard that there were other African countries that had already carried out this debt swap, they were even more interested. Countries like Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Egypt had already at one point or the other had a debt swap done. And so the country team from Sierra Leone requested a meeting with at least one of these countries, a learning session, so they could perhaps ask even deeper questions about what they could expect going through a debt swap themselves. And Global Fund promised to do whatever they could to make sure that this learning session happened. Now, I'd like to pause and say that for everyone who works in public sector, I believe that we're all very familiar with the idea of you start a reform, you're working with this group of people, and before you know it, there is a leadership change, and then you're working with brand new set of people. Well, this was exactly what happened with us with the debt swap and in Sierra Leone. Soon after that initial meeting, there was a leadership change at the Ministry of Finance, and we found a new leadership team coming up. I will reflect a little bit at the end on what that meant and what we took away from that lesson. So from the time of the initial meeting to about 6 months after, there was really nothing actively happening on this front beyond the follow-ups. Global Fund, of course, was also working on trying to get us that meeting with a country from Africa that had also carried out this debt swap. But ultimately, when that did not look like it was going to materialize, they then suggested something that was equally as good, which is a technical workshop where we would be able to look at how these debt swaps really work, ask all the deep questions about that, and then also have a learning session with a country, Antigua and Barbuda, that had also carried out a lot of debt swaps. They started with one and they had done very many by the time that this was proposed. And so 6 months after the initial meeting, Global Fund came into the country and this workshop held. The consultant who led the workshop was very knowledgeable about debt swaps, and there were so many key lessons that I learned from that we then took into our proposal writing. The first thing is the fact that theoretically every debt qualified for a debt swap. But there were some key things that differentiated what would actually happen in practice. Number one is that only debts still being serviced qualified. Number two is the fact that even though theoretically every debt qualified, that means bilateral, multilateral, and commercial loans, in actual practice, only bilateral loans, swaps have been known to go the entire hog. And even with those, sometimes you have parliamentary challenges that can delay the process, but bilateral loans, swaps have been known to be more effective. With multilateral swaps, because at the foundation of a debt swap is a debt cancellation, this would affect the capital base of the multilaterals, the international financial institutions, and so not necessarily an area where they wanted to play. With the commercial loans, most of these are private sector organizations, and so the bottom line is very critical, and therefore they can't see what the line of sight to profitability is with the debt swaps. That's not something that they were typically interested in. However, in recent times, with environment, social, and governance policies, this is now becoming an instrument that they are looking at, and this is a space that we need to watch very intensely. Then another point that was made is the fact that no country can be compelled to get into a debt swap, right? So this is voluntary completely for the creditor nation and also the debtor nation. For them to get into this space, a compelling case has to be made as to why they have to spend social, political, financial capital to co-invest in this space. What that meant was that the debtor country has to be able to make a compelling case showing mutual benefits to both themselves, but then also to the creditor country. Another thing that was flagged is that in making this case for mutual benefits, you have to be clear about the specific priority projects that you want this funding to go into so that it's easy to review, monitor, and evaluate this as it goes along. And all the guardrails, accountability, transparency also has to be there so that the creditor nation has comfort that everything is going exactly as planned and it's all kosher. And so these were the key lessons that I took away from the workshop. And of course, before they left the country, we then went to meet with the new Minister of Finance, who was very knowledgeable about this instrument, asked a few clarifying questions, and gave his blessings for us to go ahead and then start writing the proposal. And we did just that. It was a multi-stakeholder team who were also at the workshop from Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning, Economic Development, and then also representatives from the Bank of Sierra Leone. But we all worked together. We put out this proposal, reviewed by different teams, reviewed also by the legal team, the law officers department, to make sure that the language was appropriate. And then after receiving sign-offs and assents and approval from all the ministries, departments, and agencies involved in this, we were then ready to submit the proposal. Now, I've told the story in a very linear fashion, but the truth is that from the point of finalizing the proposal to submission, it took another 1 year. Yes, 1 year. Again, this is not something that would be strange to people who work in the public sector. But in the concluding episode of this debt swap series, I will be reflecting on all the roadblocks that we encountered, all the challenges, all the issues, and what we did in the interim and how we were able to push forward. Again, this is really about me documenting all the lessons that I learned from going through this process. Also hoping that you can share with me, if you've worked on reforms like this, what you also learned from that. So that will be happening in the final episode of this. But now back to our debt swap episode 3. So we submitted the proposal, and of course all that had to then happen was really watch paint dry, right? Follow-ups often as you can, and then 9 months later, just last week, we then heard that the creditor nation had reached out asking for a discussion on this. So we're excited. Woohoo! It's only taking, I don't know, approximately 3 years plus for us to get from the initial time of thinking about this to actually potentially starting conversations with the creditor. But again, I think that's one of the biggest reflection for me from working in the development and public sector is just the sheer impact of reforms. And so even though it takes a long time, when it is actually finalized, the potential for impact is amazing. The debt swap has the potential to release, unlock about $100 million for the health sector in Sierra Leone. So that is huge, that is significant. And so we now go through the rest of the process, and of course I will update and do subsequent episodes as things unfold, but that's where we are now. Proposal submitted, request for a meeting. We will be going into that meeting, and fingers crossed that everything comes out well. And so before I end this episode, again, I'll take a moment to just reflect on some of the things that came out for me from this episode. I already talked about the fact that sometimes change takes time in the public sector. But another thing was also that is almost consistent in public sector is that there will be leadership changes. And so in working on a reform, it's important that the high-level political buy-in is sought and continues to be maintained. But it's also important that the technocrats are part of the conversation. The technocrats are more permanent, and so even when there's a change in political leadership, the technocrats will be there. If they never bought into the reform, if they never owned the reform, if they were never seen as the face of the reform, then it's difficult to even begin a conversation, because you would be dealing with a leadership that is new, that still has to be sold on the reform, and a technocracy that is very opposed to the idea. And so it's important that this is owned by both the high level and then also the technocrats. I think that's one of the key things. And then it's also important to think global even while we're implementing locally. The fact that there was already the debt suspension service initiative kind of gave us an idea of some of the countries that we could already approach from the beginning, who already had this kind of mindset and that would understand the case that we were making as to why this debt service monies can actually be channeled into something else. And then the other thing I would say that also came out from this is also the fact that creating shared ownership, even beyond the major stakeholder ministry, is important. Thanks to Global Fund for the workshop that they suggested, for bringing in all these other partners to join the conversation and to be part of defining and designing this proposal so that there is shared ownership by everyone. I think that oftentimes I have also reflected the one thing that I wonder maybe we should have also done, or some of the people to have also included, would have been the civil society organizations. I mean, at the time that we were having the workshop, it was meant to be technical. It was just meant to be a small group really thinking through, understanding how this works. But at the times when it looked like nothing was happening for a long time, I did wonder if we had brought in the CSOs, will they have been able to exert a little bit more pressure to have made us move forward a little faster? I don't know. At the end of the day, it has to also be led by the country. But this is something that I do reflect on sometimes, to say maybe this is something we could have done differently. But with all of that said, yes, we're in a great place. We're moving into these conversations, and I'm excited to see how it all works out. And you, what are you working on? Did you get any way? Did you take away any valuable lesson from what I have shared? And what are you working on? Please feel free to drop me a line and tell me what you're working on, or what you would like to see more of from me. And with that said, I look forward to seeing you on the very next episode of Centers and Margins. And until then, take care.